Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. We'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive.
We are super excited to have Mike Wessinger on the Venture for Canada podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Mike has a wealth of experience building one of Canada's most successful technology companies, and we're super excited to learn from his insights today. Mike, how are you doing this morning?
Really well, very well, thank you.
In another interview, you talk about the importance of culture and how culture is essential to building a really successful company. How would you describe the culture of PointClickCare?
Yeah, it's interesting. We go by this tagline of the culture pillars: passion, people, and performance. But I'm not sure, going into the details of that accurately describe it. I would say that while we don't behave like a startup any longer, some of the things that we learned that became second nature to us during the startup phase still exist today, which is an intense focus on the health of the customer, really taking care of our customers. But also, understanding that means taking care of the team is incredibly important. And so it's almost familial. Like we look out for each other. We a deep respect for people in the organization, a deep respect for our customers. So a very human-focused organization, I would say, it's almost a dichotomy. We have this deep passion for winning, but there's a deep sense of humility. Those don't always go together. So we love to win. In fact, we want to be number one at everything we do, but we think we could do it, and we could still do it and remain humble.
That's a very Canadian approach, which is awesome. You also talk about in this other interview the importance of institutionalizing culture, particularly as a company grows and scales. In your case, you've grown from just you to now thousands of people. How do you as an executive team institutionalize the culture within the company?
Yeah, so when we got to a point where we started to recognize that the culture was slipping in a way that we didn't particularly love. And, we'd gone through a hyper growth period. And the early people had this real connection to the customer DNA and how focused they were on they could make a direct connection between making the customer successful and happy and being able to make their mortgage payment and keeping their job. And but then we woke up one day and realized there was 800 people that had never seen a day when it was difficult to get customers. They thought customers fell on trees. They thought there was money to throw at everything. And so we said, wow, there's something, something's gone amiss with the culture. And we said, all right, we need to reset it. What served us in the early days because of the environment we were in and the external pressures that were forcing us to behave the way we did were no longer there. It had to be driven from within. So we started with, let's define what that culture needs to look like. Now, the mistake we first made was, we thought we had almost crowdsourced it, get groups of people together. How do you think about the culture? After about the fourth one of those meetings, I said, this has got to stop. These are great inputs, but the reality is, my brother Dave and I are leading the company. We're the founders of the company. We're going to determine what it is, the culture it is that we want. So you can't outsource it. You can't give it to HR. You can't crowdsource it. We defined the culture that we wanted in very explicit terms. And once we had defined that culture, we said, all right, now how do we go and institutionalize it? Well, we said, there's orientation sessions where we're going to put people through 2 days. We said, well, we've already got 1,000, 1,200 people at the time, that we need to set the expectation. So, it was like, considerable expense that we ran, 1,200 people through a 2-day culture and reorientation of, hey, it told a lot of the stories that people hadn't heard from the early days of, the bootstrapping, how difficult it was, to win customers, to win the market. And then, got very explicit, in interactive workshops with culture ambassadors on how it is, what is the culture that we expect at PointClickCare. And honestly, for some people, they said, hey, that's not what I signed up for. And some people volunteered to leave. And for others, they're like, wow, this is incredible. This is exactly the culture I came for. So it started off the 2-day orientation sessions. We had culture ambassadors, and then we would try to weave in into our our reward systems and our recognition systems, the things that were related to our culture. So whether it was formal programs or informal spot bonuses, that kind of things, all related to people displaying the behaviors that we wanted to see in the organization.
There's a lot of discussion around the Great Resignation right now as we record this in March 2022, and employee retention is probably one of the most talked about topics at board tables around the country. What are some of the ways that you retain staff at the company and foster a workplace where people really want to stay?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've decoded it, and I've spent a lot of time with other leaders of tech organizations. We seem to have suffered a little less than many of our counterparts, but we're trying a lot of different things. And the first one is recognizing that we're not going back to people coming to the office 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and that we have to embrace a hybrid work model. And we also don't believe that the going to a model of completely remote work serves us well. I just know that the few days we've spent in the office, people that I've been developing a relationship with over the last 15 months, let's call it, in a 24-hour period, being able to go and break bread with them and spend time with them, be physically in the same location with them. I got to know them better from a personal perspective in 24 hours than I had in the previous 15 months. So I think, we had to commit to a hybrid model, which means that people can feel comfortable that when they join PointClickCare, that, one day we're not going to wake up and say, oh, by the way, you have to start coming to the office Monday to Friday, that they know that, they'll never be asked to come in more than a day or two a week. And that we're, going to give them all the tools they need to be successful. Yet we're going to, recognizing the value of bringing people together. We're just going to do it in a different way. We're going to come in for very focused meetings. We reconfigured every one of our offices to have neighborhoods, not individual desks, and lockers. So it feels a bit like high school, but you go in and you can leave your stuff there, but you come in and you pick a day where you can go to your neighborhoods. But we, seeing the energy around getting people together, we said, if you spread people out during the week and you get 10 or 15% of the staff in any of the offices, I'm not going to show up at our Salt Lake City office and really go there. And if there's nobody there, I'm like, why am I even here? So we're going to start off, we're going to pick a day. If you're going to go in just for the social interaction, yes, there's going to be planned times where you get together with your team. But if you're just going to show up and you want to interact, to have those casual collisions, meet with some leadership, have lunch, maybe have a drink after work, pick Wednesday. We just picked Wednesday, that if there's going to be one day a week, you're going to show up in the office and you want to be able to connect with your colleagues, let's try and focus it around Wednesday. And we think that's going to be a pretty good recipe for getting people, informally build those incredibly important trust relationships with their colleagues, and give access for new staff to be able to interact with the leadership of the organization and get some visibility.
Yeah, it's a great approach. I read an article a couple months ago, and it said that the worst situation in the new world of work is doing video calls from the office. So the point being is, if you're going to the office and you drive all the way there just to chat with people on video, some of whom are also in the office or just in other locations. And to your point, Mike, the biggest benefits of going to the office is that social, it's that tacit knowledge transfer. It's building relationships with other people. And if you can't trust that people are going to be in an office on a certain day, why go on into the office in the first place? Kind of shifting gears a little bit, as you provide kind of responses to some of the questions, I'm thinking a little bit of an interview I listened to last year with Harley Finkelstein, the president of Shopify. And he talks about how when you're a rapidly growing company like yours, people need to requalify for the job kind of each year, because the job kind of changes so much. And in your case, your role has over 25 years changed so much, from being just managing yourself at the beginning to now thousands of employees. So how did you scale your leadership abilities from running a one-person operation, yourself, to now managing a team with thousands of people?
I would say that the people that I've seen scale the furthest are those people who are lifelong learners and curious, and people who recognize that as the leader, let's say you're the leader of the organization or a leader of your department. So as a leader in the organization, my job is to work on the organization, not in it. And if you're the leader of, call it product engineering, your job is to work on it, not in it. And the people who have recognized that their job is to work on it and build it and get the right talent, people that are better than them at very specific functions, seem to be the ones who have scaled the furthest. Now, I have seen this pattern also. There are people that were good, that were good to, to 10 million. And there are the people, they were good in the, 10 million to 100 million. They wouldn't have been good before, 10 million, because they didn't really get the bootstrap world, but they were really good in the 10 to 100. But then they got to the 100 or even 200 million. They're like, oh, I can't go on these gut instincts anymore. I need more systems. I haven't had that experience. And then, we're starting to see people that are tapping at sort of the $500 million mark that were, good at, 200 million, and they sort of tap out. So not everybody makes that leap, but if I had to look at the things that, the common traits are those people who work, on their department, not in it, and they're lifelong learners and curious. And those are the people that seem to have unlimited scaling potential.
How do you cultivate your own sense of lifelong learning?
I think I'm just naturally curious. I if I don't know how to do something, I want to go learn how to do it. And sometimes that means picking up a book, but honestly, for me, the best way to learn how is connect with somebody who's already done it before, and not somebody who's seen it theoretically from the sidelines, like a consultant, but the actual person who's done it before. So getting on the phone with another CEO, for example, when I went to make the change from CEO to executive chair, I wanted to talk to half a dozen people who had done it successfully before. And I got on the phone, and they were really incredibly gracious with their time. And I spent an hour and a half with each one of them, took all of my notes, found the commonalities. I go, all right, this is a pretty good playbook for how it is I'm going to make the transition and avoid the pitfalls that they may have run into, and take advantage of the things that they found to be successful.
One thing I've noticed from interviewing dozens of different entrepreneurs and leaders through this podcast is a trait that many entrepreneurs have is a tendency towards anxiety. That the kind of only what's it, the famous there's a famous saying, only the paranoid survive, by Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. Anxiety can be kind of a double-edged sword. At a certain point, can be kind of crippling. And it's been interesting. There's a kind of a peer group of other entrepreneurs that I'm part of that I've met with regularly for the last 2 years. And one of the things that's opened my eyes being part of this group is just how many entrepreneurs really struggle with anxiety and the pressure and managing young kids and a growing business and health issues with family members and all of these different things. How have you managed anxiety through your journey building PointClickCare into the huge company it is today?
Yeah, I would say in the early days, not well. The days when we were bootstrapping, couldn't figure out, you'd meet payroll, and then you'd take a big breath and go, wow, I got another 2 weeks and we need to make another payroll. Those days were difficult. I didn't have a good way to manage that. I didn't sleep very often. I spent 18 months just trying to chase the next payroll, and that was incredibly difficult. So I don't know that I found a good way to manage it. But I think once we got through the sort of the most challenging spot, I think it was just compartmentalizing. I think a lot of it was making sure you take time away and compartmentalize, like just park it away, and just shut down. You're not thinking about work. And I found that exercise helped a lot with that. So daily, every day I find some time to go and spend in the gym, or go for a run, get on a bike, ski, whatever it might be. And I find that helps clear the mind a lot. And then at some points you just need to unplug. Put your device down. Don't check your email. Don't carry your phone around, and truly unplug. And I think that that's helped me a lot. So I don't have a lot of anxiety these days.
So in your last response, you talked about the pressure of just meeting payroll and the financial challenges that a company faces at an early stage. And one of the things I can imagine is a challenge is, as the company grows, as you raise potentially a lot of money from investors, it's easy for a lot of fat to grow on a company, where people just say, oh, we'll expense this, or there's enough budget for this. And that kind of scrappy zero-based budgeting kind of approach that it can exist in a really early stage can kind of go out the window. So how do you, as a leader, foster a kind of thrifty mentality as part of your kind of culture? Thrifty in a good way, in the sense of being very discerning and spending resources as you scale a company to the size that PointClickCare is today?
Yeah, so we actually had that challenge where we had very disciplined approach early on, because we were bootstrapped, and we really had no venture options, and we really had to go beg, borrow, and steal, stretch out suppliers and get customers to pay in advance. And so we built a good discipline around, hey, we've got a challenge. We got to think our way through this problem. And we solved a lot of problems by just thinking our way through it. And it would have been easier to throw money at it. But then we woke up one day and every time there's a problem, it's like, well, I'll just hire a body. They'll go sort that problem out. Or let's just go hire a consultant. So people started throwing money at problems instead of thinking through problems. And that this is a real challenge. So we finally went back and said, look, the only way that we're going to get people to think through challenges is if we impose constraints on them. So we got very disciplined about our budgeting process and said, look, I'm going to limit the resources you have in order to solve this challenge, and then you're necessarily going to have to think through think through a creative way to solving the problem versus just throwing money at the problem. Because if you continue to do that, yeah, you may solve the problem, but you'll wind up with so much bloat, you'll ultimately be uncompetitive because you've done everything the easy way that hasn't been thoughtful. And that's not what got us started. That's not what made us successful in the beginning. And we had to go back and make sure that we imposed limitations on resources so that people would be creative with their problem solving.
Many of the first 25 employees that you hired at the company stayed on with the company for many years and are still with the company today. What tips would you give to an entrepreneur in terms of when they're looking at the first 20, 30 employees on really how to hire people that will grow with the company over time?
In the early days, we couldn't hire the people we needed because we couldn't afford them. We hired the people that we could afford mostly. But the one thing they shared was that they had a commitment to the mission. They felt really a part of what it is we were building. So we called them the Founders Circle because they all behaved and acted like founders and felt an incredible attachment to the organization as though it were their own because they came onto her so early. And for so many of them, it kept them with the organization for a long time. And yeah, some of them outgrew the position they were in. And they recognized that, but we did a great job of replant, said, hey, you've sort of hit the ceiling over here. You haven't seen it before or done it before, but over here you could do a great job. And by the way, now you've got somebody who's joined the organization who's done this stuff before, and you're going to learn a ton from them. And I think we always had graceful ways of finding spots in the organization for the early people that behaved as though they were founders.
What's your biggest lesson learned in terms of kind of a mistake when it comes to hiring?
So you're never going to get every hire perfect. And so you test for culture, make sure that they're a cultural fit. And of course they need to be capable of doing the job. They need the skill set. I mean, that's an easier one, right? You can check on their resume and you can check the references, and that's an easy one to check for. But sometimes you don't get the cultural fit. So I think the biggest mistake is if you find somebody who's not a cultural fit, letting them hang out in that seat for too long. And the vast majority of the time, it's not an issue of they're malicious or they're not a good person, but they just may not be a fit for your organization. They could be a great fit somewhere else. But as soon as you realize that they're not going to be a fit for the organization, you got to figure out a way to gracefully exit them from your organization as quickly as possible. The longer they stay in that seat, the faster you lose credibility with the staff and go, we talk about all these cultural values, and yet this person is inconsistent with those. And because they're talented at what they do, you let them survive. And I think the longer you let them sit in that seat, the quicker you lose credibility. And so once you recognize that, you've got to make the change right away.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And exiting people with grace. One of the things that has come up a lot on this podcast that many other entrepreneurs have talked about is a challenge that sometimes exists in terms of managers being resistant to deal with performance challenges on their team. That there's a natural human instinct to avoid conflict and to not necessarily deal with difficult decisions. And in your case, in your company, you would have hundreds of managers. How do you build a culture where managers don't just say, oh, ignore an HR issue and let it fester, and then eventually it's a big mistake, versus making the tough decision that, sometimes it's better to rip the Band-Aid off and gracefully exit the person rather than just let an issue fester over time?
Yeah. So we did have that problem for a while where, people would let underperformers, stay in their seats for a long time. They're like, well, at least they're 25% of another person's productivity, but I'll just get more and more people. He said, well, at some point that comes to an end because you just become so bloated. And honestly, for the rest of the team becomes demotivating, saying, you're allowing this underperformer to continue along here when you're holding everybody else to a higher standard. So one of the things that helped us, we implemented a calibration system where you sit down with a group of peers and you evaluate teams of people. And so if they rank inconsistent, if they're inconsistent for, two reviews in a row, then you've got a number of peers going, well, hey, how can you let this continue? You've had somebody that's been rated as inconsistent. They're not underperforming for two in a row. Immediately it's time to make a decision. So yes, it may last for 6 months, but you don't have these people sitting in the seat underperforming for years at a time. If they continue to rate inconsistent, and it's sort of a peer group that evaluates their performance, so you get perspectives from different departments, different team members. And so it's not a single manager that says, I rate them, I rate them as a high performer, when there could be 4 other people doing the calibration going, everybody else sees it differently. And you have a discussion, a healthy debate around, hey, is this somebody we can rehab? Can we get them, can we get them on a program to get them better? Or is this somebody who's just not a fit for the organization? And so, it creates a bit of a peer pressure to make sure that the underperformers are identified as such, and that they don't continue along on the team if they continue to be underperformers.
On the topic of talent, you've had to hire thousands of people, and your company has grown a ton over the last 5 years in particular. How have you scaled your talent acquisition operations to hire so many people while maintaining a high bar of employee excellence?
Well, I think, it's been getting the right recruiters and trying to work on our employer brand. We spend an awful lot of time on it. You have to pitch for talent the same way you pitch for new customers. And in fact, it's probably more difficult these days to get the talent in. And so we made incredible investments in our recruiting teams, and we've broadened the base of to sort of where we fill the funnel for talent. But I still think that we struggle a little bit with an employer brand. I think the thing that defines us as part of our culture we talked about earlier, which is we're incredibly competitive and love to win, but we're humble. It serves us well sometimes, but I run into frequently to people in the Toronto tech community that still don't know who PointClickCare is, even at our scale. And so I think we need to do a better job of really promoting our employer brand, which means sometimes we need to tuck that humility away and talk about all the great things we do and the great things we do for our team members.
Before this interview, I did a little research on your executive team, and it's an incredibly impressive group of people. Reading through their biographies, what have you found have been some of the most effective tactics in terms of recruiting executive leaders to join your company?
Yeah. So I think very quickly we recognized if we want to find somebody who had done the job for a company larger than us, public or private, private equity backed, who had seen it before, we had to start with a coast to coast search. We couldn't start and say, hey, we'll start in the GTA and then move Ontario wide and then Canada wide. We said, look, what's most important is not where they live or where their location is. It's are they the best fit for the organization? So we would start coast to coast search for for all the C-level positions. We would use an executive search firm and go as wide as we could to try and find the best talent independent of where they were and be comfortable with tolerating the commute. And a huge chunk of our executive team is in Boston, but they when we moved to when the pandemic hit, it was a real challenge for us to make the adaptation because most of these people had been only traveling, some every week, but some every second week into to our headquarters in Toronto. So it was a fairly smooth transition. But I think, just casting the widest net possible and trying to find those people that are a cultural fit and that have the skill set and the experiences we need to grow the organization.
On the topic, kind of shifting gears about the Canadian startup ecosystem in general, it's an unfortunate fact that there are very few companies in the country that reach the size of PointClickCare. I saw a recent article that I believe your company is the public knowledge that it's worth over $4 billion. You employ thousands of people across the country. And relative to the United States on a proportional level, there are far fewer companies in Canada that are a PointClickCare size, even taking into account our population, than in the United States. Why do you think this gap between Canada and the United States exists when it comes to the tech sector?
Yeah, so I have interesting insights. I've spent a lot of time since Labor Day of last year when I made the change to executive chair with them. So I spent a lot of time with Canadian startups and scale-up companies, and I ran into a number of them that seem to have a lot of the same challenges. And I'm like, companies in San Francisco would not have this challenge. Why are they have this same challenge? And so I started to peel back the layers of the onion, and all the ones that were sort of under 10 million in recurring revenue had sort of the same challenges. The ones that were north of there was different. And I think part of the problem is that Canadian companies get capital from the wrong sources early. There is not a healthy competitive market for seed and early stage capital. And so what happens to these founders? They go, oh, I didn't get a great valuation. I'm going to go to the angel investors, and they find these angel investors, and then they wind up with the board. I'm like, just tell me a little bit about your board. And this happened to me half a dozen times in the fall. Said, this guy made us money in oil and gas, and this lady, she's more a mining person, and this guy's a really great corporate lawyer. I'm like, how many of them have ever built a software company? The answer is 0. So they're all smart, but they have no idea. There's a playbook on how to build a startup business-to-business software company, and they have no idea what it is. So they're giving you good advice. They're just a bunch of smart people sitting around the table that have no idea, no pattern recognition at all. The problem is that what they needed was a venture capitalist that focuses on software, and they needed someone to come in and give them a healthy valuation, not a, hey, I've only got one other competitor in Canada valuation, because it's a local game. Like someone from San Francisco or Boston or Austin isn't going to come in and write $1 million check and pay attention to it. It's a local game. And so if there's not competition there, then one of two things happens. They either go and get capital from the wrong source that isn't helpful to them, or they give up too much of the company too early. So they got this crappy valuation, and then they go to their Series A. By the time they get to their Series A, the founders own 30% of the company. And guess what happens? As soon as it's hard for them to recruit executives, their owners, American-based, likely by the Series A, say it's time to move the headquarters to Boston or Philadelphia or Austin or San Francisco, and then they're gone. So they never scale. So I think if there was a healthier early stage venture community in Canada that was competitive, that actually paid up with proper valuations, then entrepreneurs would take money from the right sources, local sources in Canada, scale their companies. By the time they got to Series A, the founders would own the vast majority of the company. By the time they get the Series B, they probably still control the company, and they could remain in Canada and scale in Canada and not be, I know 100% for sure, if my brother and I didn't control the company, that our headquarters, given that 95% of our business is south of the border, would have been moved to somewhere in the US 10 years ago. There's no doubt in my mind. But we wanted to build a great company in Canada that was, mind and management headquartered in Canada. Even though 40% of our staff is in the US, the mind and management headquarters is in Canada. And that wouldn't have happened unless we controlled the company. So if we want to change that dynamic, start at the very beginning, get a healthy, vibrant venture community that will pay proper valuation so that people will get money from the right source in Canada and still control the company by the time they get through their Series A financing.
I'm sure you could have sold a company at various points and gone on and lived on a beach somewhere and just not worried about anything for the rest of your life. What kept you motivated to not sell out and to keep on building PointClickCare bigger and bigger?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always had ambitions of building an incredibly, successful, large Canadian headquartered company. I mean, I don't want to hear the stories about, Nortel or BlackBerry. I mean, there should be Canadian stories, more Shopify's, more PointClickCares that create, scale businesses that are still, Canadian headquartered. And I have a passion for doing that. But I've also seen that, the more organizations we get that are measured in the hundreds of millions and ultimately in the billions of revenue, it helps the entire ecosystem. So where every time I've had to go get a C-level officer that's done it for a company larger than us before, the universe of Canadian companies I could recruit from or that had that experience is infinitesimally small. So I necessarily have to look south of the border. But I've watched people who joined us at 25 and stuck around to 200 million, or joined at 100 and left at 300 million of revenue. And they've gone on after they've left us to become the COO and then president or CEO of the next $25 million company going on 50 or $80 million company going on 150. And watching that going, oh, right. So the next wave of companies that is, approaching the 100 million or the $200 million threshold, there are places that Canadians that they can find to do that job who have done it before in Canada. And I think the more companies we can get crossing that threshold of the 100 million, then 500 million, a billion, the more people that we will have domestically to run the next wave of technology companies. And so I have a passion for being a part of making that happen and seeing. I used to get sad when people who grew up with us, they sort of hit the upper limits of where they're capable at, and then I watch them leave and go run another company and take them through that same journey again, and it's so incredibly rewarding to see that happen.
I couldn't agree more. It's at the core of Venture for Canada's mission, and that's our thesis as an organization, that the most effective way to develop entrepreneurial talent is to have entrepreneurial young people work in startups and scale-ups and small businesses across the country, because that's ultimately where you learn how to build a really successful business over time. And there's an excellent book called The Startup Community Way by Brad Feld, which I'm just looking over there, where he talks about that there's all these incubators, accelerators that kind of across the world in Canada. But his argument is like the greatest single driver of entrepreneurial or incubator of entrepreneurial talent are really successful technology companies. That one really successful technology company will spawn out way more entrepreneurs than any incubator or than most incubators and accelerators ever will.
I couldn't agree more. I've just watched, talent that has left us and the impact that they've made on other organizations. It's incredible. They go in and they have this. You can get smart people sitting around. You can solve problems, but time is the enemy. And you iterate and iterate and iterate. And maybe you'll get to the right conclusion. But when you bring somebody in who's done it before, like you cut out all those cycles. You're like, no, we've already tried all that stuff. This is what works. And so, we may need to adjust it for the context of this business, but there's a pattern here and we could just implement it right away and shortcut this thing by 10 months or 6 months or 8 months. And I've just watched it over and over. I know that's the impact that when we brought executives into our organization, that's the kind of impact that they made. And the people who have left us to help the next group of Canadian companies grow, they've had an immediate impact on those organizations and changed the angle of growth. It's been incredible to watch.
Mike, it's been a true pleasure speaking with you. We've covered a wide range of topics, from culture and how to scale culture, to talent retention, to talent recruitment, to some of the challenges in building really successful technology companies here in Canada. What you built at PointClickCare is incredibly impressive and a phenomenal role model for so many entrepreneurs across the country. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Great. The pleasure is mine. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.